Let me tell you about Marcus Webb. Marcus was born in 1964 in a small apartment on the south side of Atlanta, Georgia, to a single mother named Ruth Webb, a woman who worked the breakfast and lunch shift at a diner 6 days a week and somehow, always had food on the table and a pressed shirt on her son's back when he walked out the door. Ruth was not a woman of many words, but she had a saying she repeated to Marcus almost every single morning while she fixed his collar or wiped a smudge off his cheek. Marcus, baby, there is nothing in this world that hard work and dignity can't get you through. She believed it with everything she had, and she passed that belief straight into the bones of her son. Marcus was a big kid, tall and broad-shouldered even at 15, with a wide, easy smile and eyes that always looked like they were thinking about something quiet and important. He was not the loudest boy in the room. He was never the loudest boy in the room. But people noticed him anyway. There was something about the way he carried himself, unhurried, steady, like a man who had already decided a long time ago exactly who he was going to be. He was not a perfect student. School was hard, money was tight, and sometimes Marcus had to work after class, bagging groceries, washing dishes at a restaurant on Peachtree Street, helping a neighbor move furniture on weekends. But he never complained. Not once. Because Ruth Webb had not raised a complainer. At 22, Marcus got his commercial driver's license. It was the proudest day of his life up to that point. He framed the certificate and hung it on the wall of his bedroom. To someone else, it might have seemed like a small thing. To Marcus, it was a door. A real, solid door swinging wide open. He started driving for a private car service in Atlanta. Long hours, early mornings, late nights. But Marcus loved it. The independence of the road, the rhythm of the city streets, the quiet satisfaction of a job done well. He was good at it. Punctual, professional, smooth behind the wheel even in rush hour traffic on I-285. And somewhere along the way, he met Diana. Diana Carter was a third-grade schoolteacher, small and bright-eyed. With natural hair she wore in two puffs and a laugh that could fill an entire hallway. They met at a church picnic in the summer of 1989. Marcus spilled lemonade on her shoes. Diana looked down at her shoes, looked up at Marcus, and said, very calmly, "You are going to owe me a pair of shoes, sir." Marcus laughed so hard he nearly fell over. He bought her 3 pairs. They were married 2 years later. A small ceremony in the backyard of Ruth Webb's house. Paper lanterns strung between the oak trees. Diana's sisters crying before the vows even started. It was not fancy. It was perfect. And in 1996, Imani Webb came into the world, 7 pounds, 4 ounces, with her father's serious eyes and her mother's impossible smile. Marcus held her in the delivery room and did not say anything for a very long time. He just looked at her. When Diana finally asked what he was thinking, he said, "I'm thinking that I would do anything. Anything in this world. For this little girl." He had no idea how true that would turn out to be, or how much it would cost him. Now let me tell you about Richard Caldwell. Richard Caldwell was born into money. That is the first thing you need to understand about him. Not because money makes a person bad, but because Richard Caldwell had never once in his life been told no by anyone who mattered. And that kind of upbringing, that consistent, polished absence of consequence, does something to a person. It hollows something out. By the mid-1990s, Richard Caldwell was 57 years old and one of the most recognizable names in Atlanta. Caldwell Enterprises, his company, had its fingers in real estate development, luxury vehicle imports, private investment portfolios, and a string of commercial properties stretching from downtown Atlanta to the suburbs of Buckhead. He was silver-haired, square-jawed, and impeccably dressed in a way that seemed effortless because for Richard Caldwell, it was effortless. He had a personal stylist, a personal chef, and a personal assistant who knew his coffee order, his dentist appointment schedule, and exactly how many seconds he liked his eggs soft-boiled. On Sundays, Richard Caldwell sat in the front row of First Methodist Church on Peachtree Road and sang the hymns louder than anyone around him. He was on the board of 3 Atlanta charities. His name was on the side of a children's hospital wing. People shook his hand at galas and smiled for photos and told their wives later what a wonderful man Richard Caldwell was. But here is the thing about men like Richard Caldwell. The shine is always on the outside. Behind the charity donations and the Sunday hymns, Richard Caldwell was a man who had built his empire not just through hard work and smart deals, but through a very practiced willingness to use people and discard them. whenever it was convenient. Employees who asked too many questions were let go. Business partners who became liabilities were cut off. And people who threatened to expose the cracks in his perfect surface were buried. Quietly, efficiently, without regret. His wife, Margaret Caldwell, was a tall, blonde woman from old Georgia money who had long ago stopped looking at her husband too closely. She had her garden, her book club, her charitable committees. She had learned that there were rooms in Richard's life she was not supposed to enter. She had made a kind of peace with that, the cold, comfortable peace of a woman who has chosen her cage carefully. In 1994, Marcus Webb came to work as Richard Caldwell's private driver. The pay was good, better than anything Marcus had earned before. It would mean a real house for Diana and baby Imani. It would mean a savings account. It would mean a future. Marcus shook Richard Caldwell's hand on his first day and told him he would not regret it. Richard looked at Marcus's hand in his for just a half-second too long before shaking it. He said, "I'm sure I won't." For 2 years, Marcus drove Richard Caldwell everywhere. Business meetings, airport runs, dinner engagements, private events. He was professional, discreet, and dependable to the minute. Richard rarely spoke to him beyond giving directions and occasionally commenting on traffic. Marcus did not mind. The job was the job, and the job was good. He bought Diana a house in East Atlanta, a 3-bedroom with a porch and a backyard big enough for Imani to run in. He planted a small garden on the left side of the yard because Diana had mentioned once, just once, that she had always wanted one. He did not tell her he had planted it. He just let her find it one morning, and the sound she made when she saw it was the kind of sound Marcus tucked away in his chest and kept forever. Life was good. Life was really, genuinely, finally good. And then the phone rang. It was a Saturday morning in April of 1996 when Richard Caldwell's 1967 Shelby Mustang disappeared from his private garage. Now, you need to understand what this car meant to Richard Caldwell. The Shelby Mustang was not just a vehicle. It was not just an expensive toy. It was Richard's crown jewel, a perfectly restored, fire-engine-red piece of American automotive history that he had purchased for a staggering sum at a private auction and then spent another small fortune restoring to showroom condition. It sat in his temperature-controlled garage like a museum piece, covered with a breathable cotton tarp, polished twice a month by a specialist Richard flew in from Charlotte. He loved that car the way some men love their children. Maybe more. When he walked into the garage that Saturday morning and found it gone, the sound that came out of Richard Caldwell was not grief. It was not panic. It was something cold and precise and immediate. He picked up his phone and called the police. And then, before the police had even arrived, before a single fingerprint had been lifted, before one security camera had been checked, he called his attorney and said one name: Marcus Webb. Now, here's what you need to know. Marcus Webb had been given access to the garage and to one specific set of keys because his job sometimes required him to move vehicles within the property. That was it. That was the entire reason. Access given for a practical, documented, employment-related purpose. But Richard Caldwell did not present it that way. To the police, to his attorney, and eventually to a grand jury, Richard Caldwell presented the narrative of a trusted employee who had abused his access. A man given an opportunity and overcome by temptation. He delivered this narrative with the calm, measured, deeply credible voice of a man who had sat at 1,000 boardroom tables and convinced 1,000 rooms of people of 1,000 things. And people believed him. Because people always believed Richard Caldwell. But here is what really happened that Saturday. Marcus Webb was not anywhere near that garage. He was sitting in the 3rd row of Imani's school auditorium, watching his 6-year-old daughter perform in her kindergarten spring recital. She played a flower. She wore a green leotard and yellow petals around her head that Diana had sewn by hand the night before. She forgot one line of her song and improvised something about butterflies that made the entire auditorium laugh. Marcus had a disposable camera in his jacket pocket, and he used every single one of its 24 exposures. He had an alibi. A perfect, beautiful, 24-photo alibi. It would not matter. The police arrived at Marcus and Diana's house before sunrise on a Monday morning, 6 days after the car was reported missing. Marcus heard the knock before Diana did. That heavy, authoritative, early morning knock that no one wants to hear. And he went to the door in his t-shirt and pajama bottoms, sleep still in his eyes, certain there had been some mistake. There was no mistake. There were 2 officers and a detective. There were handcuffs. And there was Diana at the top of the stairs, her hand over her mouth, and Imani behind her, peeking around her mother's legs with wide, frightened eyes, not yet understanding what she was seeing but knowing, the way children always somehow know, that something had been broken. Marcus did not fight. He did not raise his voice. He asked, very calmly, very quietly, if he could get dressed. They let him. Diana went to the bedroom with him and held his face in both her hands while he buttoned his shirt, and she said, "We are going to fix this, Marcus. This is not how your story ends." He kissed her forehead. He kissed Imani on top of her head. He walked out the front door in handcuffs while the neighbors came to their windows. Later that day, from a holding cell, Marcus Webb was allowed to make one phone call. He called his court-appointed attorney, a young man named Thomas Green who was 3 years out of law school and carrying a caseload that would have broken a more experienced lawyer. Across town, Richard Caldwell's attorney, a senior partner at one of Atlanta's most expensive firms, a man who had successfully defended for corporate executives and 2 politicians, was already building the case that would destroy Marcus Webb's life. It was not a fair fight. It was never meant to be. The trial lasted 4 days. Thomas Green did everything he could. He presented the photographs from the recital. He called Diana as a witness. He challenged the timeline. But Richard Caldwell's attorney was a surgeon. He dissected every piece of evidence. He questioned the reliability of Diana as a witness. She was the defendant's wife, after all. He pointed out that the photographs were undated on the camera roll. He produced a security log that showed Marcus's keycard had been used to access the garage the previous Thursday, 2 days before the theft, and implied a pattern of suspicious behavior. And then he called Richard Caldwell to the stand. Richard Caldwell in the witness box was a masterclass in performance. He spoke slowly and sadly. He said he had trusted Marcus, genuinely trusted him, and that this betrayal had wounded him deeply. His voice cracked slightly at one point, just enough. Several jurors visibly softened. Marcus sat at the defense table and watched his employer, the man whose car he had driven, whose gates he had opened, whose family he had moved through the city for 2 years, perform his destruction with grace and precision, and he felt something inside himself go very, very still. Guilty. 8 years. Diana collapsed. Her sister caught her. Imani, sitting in the gallery with her aunt, started crying. Not because she understood, but because her mother was crying, and her father had turned around to look at her one last time before they took him, and the look on his face was the saddest thing she had ever seen. She would never fully forget it. She would carry it for the rest of her life. Marcus Webb was taken to Fulton County Correctional Facility on a Tuesday afternoon. He was 32 years old. Can you even imagine? Can you imagine being a father, a good father, and having someone take everything from you? Not because you did anything wrong, but simply because you were the most convenient person to blame? Drop a comment below. Tell me, what would you do? How would you survive that? There are certain kinds of grief that do not announce themselves loudly. They do not come in a single wave. They come slowly, day after day after day, wearing you down the way water wears down stone, so gradually you barely notice until one morning you look in the mirror and see how much of yourself is gone. That was Diana Webb's grief. After Marcus went to prison, Diana did what she had always done. She kept going. She had no choice. She had Imani. So she got up every morning, put on her teacher clothes, drove to school, sat at her little desk in front of 30 small faces, and taught them how to read. She came home, made dinner, helped Imani with her homework, read her a story, tucked her in. And then she sat in the kitchen alone, sometimes until midnight, writing letters to Marcus that she would mail the next morning. She fought the case. She hired a new attorney when she saved enough money. She filed appeals. She wrote to advocacy organizations, to civil rights groups, to anyone who would listen. Most did not listen. The ones who did were sorry, were sympathetic, were moving on to the next case. The system that had taken her husband was not designed to give him back easily. Marcus wrote to Imani every single week. Without exception. Not 1 week passed without a letter arriving in that small blue mailbox at the end of their driveway. Handwritten, front and back, in Marcus's careful, looping cursive. He wrote about everything. About the books he was reading. About the other men he met and what he learned from them. About memories of Imani as a baby, as a toddler, as the little flower in the spring recital. About his mother Ruth and the things she used to say. about the garden he was going to plant when he got home. And he wrote about her future. Every letter ended the same way. Keep going, baby girl. Keep going, and don't you stop. The world owes you everything good that's in it, and I am going to be there to watch you take it. I love you more than all the words and all the letters I will ever write you. Daddy. Imani kept every letter. Every single one. In a worn cardboard shoebox that she slid under her bed each night and checked every morning, the way some people check their phone, just to make sure it was still there, that it was all still real. Inside Fulton County Correctional, Marcus Webb survived on a combination of quiet discipline and something his mother would have called spiritual stubbornness. He refused to be broken. He refused to become bitter in a way that would eat him hollow. That did not mean it was easy. It was not easy. There were nights, long, airless, fluorescent nights, when the weight of what had happened pressed down on him so hard he could barely breathe. When he thought about Imani growing up without him, about Diana carrying everything alone, about the 8 years stretching out in front of him like a sentence written in a language he had never learned. But in his second year at Fulton, Marcus met Raymond Cole. Raymond Cole was 63 years old, soft-spoken and wire-thin, with reading glasses that sat permanently on the end of his nose and a mind that operated with the precision of a well-maintained clock. He had been a defense attorney in Atlanta for 25 years before he was disbarred under what he described, with characteristic understatement, as manufactured circumstances. He had been in Fulton for 4 years, serving time on a conviction that had too many of the same fingerprints as Marcus's own. Raymond recognized Marcus's case immediately, not because he had heard of it, though he had, vaguely, but because of the shape of it, the clean, geometric precision of how it had been constructed, the way every piece of evidence had landed just so, just conveniently enough, without a single loose thread. That car was never stolen, Raymond told Marcus one evening, sitting across from him in the prison library. He said it quietly, like a doctor delivering a diagnosis. I've seen this pattern before. The vehicle was moved. This was insurance fraud. And you were the cover story. Marcus stared at him for a long moment. He already knew, had known in his bones since the moment the gavel fell, that he had been set up. But hearing it said plainly, by someone who understood how these things worked, was something different. It was the first time since his conviction that anyone with real knowledge had looked at his case and told him he was right. He cried that night, quietly, alone in his bunk, with his face turned to the wall so no one would see. He cried for himself and for Diana and for Imani. And then he made himself stop, and he made himself a promise. He was going to find a way out of this. And when he got out, the truth was coming with him. Meanwhile, in the East Atlanta house, Diana's health was quietly declining. She had always been strong, fierce and bright, and seemingly inexhaustible. But the years of working double shifts and fighting appeals and raising a daughter alone were taking something from her that she could not earn back. She started getting headaches that wouldn't leave. She stopped eating properly. She was tired in a way that sleep could not fix. In the spring of 2012, when Imani was 16 years old, Diana Webb had a stroke in the kitchen on a Sunday morning. Imani found her. Diana survived the first stroke. She did not survive the second one, 3 weeks later. She was 46 years old. Imani sat at her mother's bedside and held her hand as the machines went quiet, and she did not cry. Not then, not yet. She would cry later, alone, for a very long time. But in that moment, she felt something happen inside her that she could only describe, years later, as a door closing and a window opening. Her grief and her love for her father, already enormous, already bone-deep, fused together into something new. Something that had edges. Something that had a plan. She was 16 years old, and she made a decision sitting in that hospital room that she would not revisit or second-guess for the next 8 years. She was going to get her father out of prison, and the man who had put him there was going to face every consequence of what he had done. Imani moved to Chicago to live with her Aunt Carol, her mother's sister, a quiet, practical woman who gave Imani a room, a bus pass, and the gift of staying out of her way while she healed. She enrolled at the University of Illinois. She studied criminology. And she waited. Because the best revenge, Imani Webb had decided, was not fast. It was thorough. If you are watching this story and thinking about someone in your life who has been wronged by a system that was never built for them, this one is for you. Hit that like button and keep watching. Because we are just getting started. 8 years of letters. 8 years of waiting. 8 years of building herself into someone who could do what needed to be done. Imani Webb graduated from the University of Illinois with a degree in criminology and a minor in communications, top of her class, in the spring of 2018. She was 22 years old. Her Aunt Carol sat in the bleachers with a sign that said "Go Imani" in bright red letters and cried from the moment the processional started until well after the ceremony ended. Imani smiled in all the photos. She accepted her diploma. She thanked her professors, hugged her aunt, and drove back to Carol's apartment where she sat at the kitchen table and opened her laptop and began, very methodically, to research Richard Caldwell. 2 years later, in the fall of 2020, Imani Webb moved back to Atlanta. But she did not move back as Imani Webb. She moved back as Imani Carter. The name change was legal, a formal process, paperwork, and court filing, done quietly with the help of a legal aid attorney who did not ask too many questions. Imani Carter, her mother's maiden name. She kept her first name because she refused to give up the name her parents had given her, the name her father had whispered into her hair when she was 6 days old. She rented a small apartment in Midtown. She got a job. The job was at Harrington PR Firm, a mid-sized public relations company whose client list included 2 Atlanta City Council members, a luxury hotel brand, a real estate developer, and one Richard Caldwell of Caldwell Enterprises. This was not a coincidence. Imani had spent 2 years mapping Richard Caldwell's life from a distance. His business structure, his social network, his public-facing team, his vulnerabilities. She had identified Harrington PR as the firm that managed his reputation, his press appearances, his charitable image. She had studied the firm's public postings and applied for an account coordinator position with a resume and cover letter she had spent 3 months refining. She walked into her interview in a charcoal blazer and her mother's small pearl earrings. Diana had given them to her the last Christmas before she died, and she sat across from the hiring manager and answered every question with the calm, focused intelligence of someone who had prepared for this exact moment for 8 years. She got the job. For the first 6 months, Imani kept her head down. She learned the firm, the people, the accounts. She was excellent at her job, genuinely excellent. Not performatively so, because Imani Webb had her mother's discipline and her father's steadiness, and she was not about to let herself be dismissed as average. She made herself indispensable. She stayed late. She anticipated what her supervisors needed before they asked. She built a reputation quietly and deliberately, the same way she did everything. And then, in the spring of 2021, Harrington PR hosted a gala at the Four Seasons in Buckhead, a charity event that Richard Caldwell attended as a featured donor. Imani was assigned to work the event. She had seen photographs of Richard Caldwell hundreds of times. She had watched video footage of his interviews and speeches and public appearances until she could have described his mannerisms in her sleep. But seeing him in person, seeing him walk into a room at 71 years old, still silver-haired, still square-jawed, still commanding the space around him like gravity, was something different. She felt her heart rate spike for exactly 3 seconds. She counted them, and then she breathed, and she smoothed her expression into something warm and professional, and she went back to work. An hour into the event, Richard Caldwell was standing near the bar with a glass of bourbon and no one particularly interesting to talk to, and Imani walked over to check on the display she had arranged near his corner of the room. He spoke first. "You did the centerpieces?" he asked, gesturing at the floral arrangement she was adjusting. "I helped coordinate them," she said. "Do you like them?" "I do," he said. He studied her for a moment. "You have a very steady quality about you. I don't know how else to describe it." He said it like a compliment and also like a question, like he was trying to place her somewhere. "Thank you," Imani said. "I think that's the nicest thing anyone has said to me at a work event." Richard laughed. It was a genuine laugh, surprised out of him. "Richard Caldwell," he said, extending his hand. "Imani Carter," she said, and shook it. She held his gaze for exactly the right amount of time. Not challenging, not deferential, just steady, just herself. He requested her specifically for his next Harrington event 3 weeks later. And so it began. Over the following months, the relationship between Imani and Richard Caldwell deepened in the way these things do when one person is very skilled and very patient and the other person is old and lonely in ways he has never quite acknowledged to himself. Richard began requesting Imani as his primary point of contact at Harrington. He consulted her on messaging for his charitable campaigns. He took her to lunch twice to discuss his upcoming foundation announcement. And Imani listened. She always listened. She had the extraordinary gift, cultivated and refined and practiced over years, of making whoever she was speaking with feel like the most interesting, most important person in the room. She remembered details he mentioned in passing. She asked intelligent follow-up questions. She was genuinely curious in a way that was also completely controlled. Richard began to confide in her. Carefully at first, business frustrations, strategic concerns, his impatience with certain board members. Then less carefully, Margaret was distant. His son from a previous marriage had not spoken to him in 2 years. His old friends were either dead or inconvenient. Richard Caldwell, for all his silver-haired authority, was a lonely man looking for someone who would simply sit with him without wanting something. He thought Imani Carter was that person. He had no idea what she wanted. At home, alone in her midtown apartment, Imani kept a second notebook, careful, dated, locked. She recorded everything Richard said. Every slip, every hint, every bourbon-loosened remark about the past. She was building a map. Slowly, patiently, the way her father had taught her without knowing he was teaching her. Steady does it. Steady gets you there. One evening in November of 2021, Richard Caldwell had too much bourbon at a private dinner and said something he probably should not have said. "You know," he said, swirling his glass, eyes going soft at the edges, "I've done things I'm not proud of. Things that I told myself were necessary. Business decisions. That's what I called them. Business decisions." He paused. "I once ruined a perfectly good man. Over something stupid. Over pride and money and panic." He looked at his glass. "I don't think about it as much as I should." Imani sat very still. She kept her face completely open, completely neutral, completely safe. "What happened to him?" she asked. Her voice did not shake. It did not shake at all. Richard looked up at her. Something shifted behind his eyes, a flicker of something that might have been caution or guilt, or both, and then he smiled and said, "That's a very old story," and changed the subject. Imani smiled back. She nodded and let him change the subject. She picked up her water glass and took a calm sip. Inside, her entire body was electric. She was close. She was so close. "Don't go anywhere. I promise you. What happens next is going to make your jaw drop. And if you haven't subscribed yet, right now is the moment. This story is about to break wide open." Here is what Imani already suspected, based on 2 years of research, Raymond Cole's notes, and every scrap of information she had managed to piece together from public records, legal filings, and the careful accumulation of things Richard Caldwell said when he was not being careful. The Shelby Mustang was never stolen. In the mid-1990s, Caldwell Enterprises was carrying a significant amount of debt that Richard Caldwell had been managing, or rather, mismanaging, through a complicated web of insurance policies and financial instruments that existed right on the edge of legality. The Shelby Mustang, insured for a very substantial sum, had been moved to a private storage facility in Macon, Georgia. Not stolen, not sold, just hidden. The plan was to report it stolen, collect the insurance payout, use that money to plug a specific hole in the Caldwell Enterprises books before a quarterly review, and then quietly arrange for the car to reappear in some context that would close the loop. It was insurance fraud, deliberate, calculated, and competently constructed. The only problem was that the insurance company had begun asking questions. They had dispatched an investigator. There was a small but real risk that the fraud would be uncovered before the timeline could be completed. Richard Caldwell needed someone to have stolen that car. A real person. A credible suspect. Someone with documented access to the garage. Someone without the financial resources to mount a serious legal defense. Someone whose word would never carry more weight than Richard Caldwell's word in a Georgia courtroom in 1996. He needed Marcus Webb. And Marcus Webb was right there, employed, accessible, trusting. This was not a decision Richard made in a moment of panic. Imani had come to understand this. It was not impulsive. He had thought about it, planned it, executed it with the same methodical efficiency he applied to everything in his life. He had spoken to his accountant, a man named Gary Simmons, and to his attorney, and he had given instructions that were followed precisely. Gary Simmons had been the one to coordinate the car's movement to the Macon storage facility. He had been the one to adjust certain records. He had been paid well for his compliance and told, very clearly, what the consequences of noncompliance would look like. And then Marcus Webb went to prison, and the insurance payout came through, and Caldwell Enterprises survived its quarterly review, and Richard Caldwell went back to church the following Sunday and sang the hymns louder than anyone around him. Imani had built this picture slowly. A detail from Raymond's notes here, a public financial record there, a comment from Richard himself, a document she had found in a file that should have been locked, but wasn't because Richard Caldwell had not, in 25 years, imagined that anyone would ever come looking. But there was one piece she still needed. One human being who had been there and who knew the full shape of what had happened. Gary Simmons. She found him through Raymond Cole. Raymond had been released from Fulton County in 2019, his own conviction quietly overturned after an advocacy organization took up his case. He had contacted Imani after she reached out through the prison's official correspondence system, explaining only that she was the daughter of Marcus Webb and that she needed to speak with someone who remembered the case. Raymond Cole, to his immense and enduring credit, called her back within 48 hours. They met in person at a diner in Decatur, Georgia. Raymond was 70 now, thinner, grayer, with the reading glasses still perched on the end of his nose, and he looked at Imani across the table for a long moment, and then said, "You look exactly like him." Around the eyes. Imani had to excuse herself to the bathroom for 3 minutes before she could continue the conversation. Raymond gave her everything he had, his notes from his years at Fulton, the name of the guard who had told him things he should not have told him, the name he had heard mentioned in connection with Caldwell's finances. Gary Simmons. Imani tracked Gary Simmons to Murfreesboro, Tennessee, through a combination of public records, LinkedIn, and one phone call to a former Caldwell Enterprises employee who did not realize what he was sharing. She drove to Murfreesboro alone on a Thursday morning in January 2022. She had not told anyone where she was going. She parked outside a modest ranch house on a quiet street and sat in her car for 10 minutes, just breathing, and then she walked up the front path and knocked on the door. The door opened, and Gary Simmons, 60 years old, heavy-set, with the complexion of a man who had not slept easily in a long time, looked at her face and went completely still. "Oh," he said, very quietly. "Oh no. My name is Imani Webb," she said. "Not Carter. Webb. Marcus Webb is my father." Gary Simmons closed his eyes. He stood in his doorway with his eyes closed for what felt like a very long time. Then he opened the door wider and said, "You better come in." They sat at his kitchen table for 4 hours. Gary told her everything. Not reluctantly. Not the way a man reveals things when he is cornered, but the way a man speaks when he has been carrying something too heavy for too long and someone has finally come to help him put it down. He told her about the car, about the storage facility, about the records he had adjusted, about the payment he had received, about the conversation he had with Richard Caldwell where Richard had been very precise about what would happen to Gary and his family if Gary ever said anything to anyone. He told her that he had thought about Marcus Webb almost every day for 26 years. "I knew he was innocent," Gary said. "I knew at the moment I heard they'd arrested him. I knew, and I said nothing. I told myself it wasn't my problem. I told myself I had a family. I told myself Richard would destroy me." He looked at his hands on the table. "I destroyed myself anyway, just from the inside." Imani looked at him for a long moment. She thought about her father in his bunk at Fulton County, writing letters. She thought about her mother at the kitchen table in the middle of the night. She thought about a little girl pressing her hands against a chain-link fence. "Are you willing to testify?" she asked. Gary Simmons nodded. "Yes," he said. "I've been waiting for someone to ask me." Before Imani moved, she did one more thing. She contacted the FBI, not the Atlanta Police Department, not a local prosecutor. The FBI, because the fraud that Richard Caldwell had committed crossed state lines. The car had been moved to another state. And because Imani Webb was not interested in a local fix that could be quietly undone by local connections. She had watched the local system fail her father. She was not going to trust it with his freedom. She had spent months, quietly and methodically, assembling a package. Gary Simmons's account, Raymond Cole's notes, the public financial records she had compiled, the documents she had identified through Caldwell Enterprises' own SEC filings, and the careful, dated notes she had taken of every conversation with Richard Caldwell over 2 years. She sent the package to the FBI's Atlanta field office with a 12-page cover letter she had written and revised 47 times. An agent called her back within the week. The investigation that followed took 8 months. Imani was interviewed 3 times. Raymond Cole was interviewed twice. Gary Simmons, who had hired his own attorney and was seeking a cooperation agreement, was interviewed extensively. Federal investigators pulled Caldwell Enterprises' financial records from 1994 through 1997. They located the storage facility in Macon. The unit itself was long gone, but the rental records were not. They found the insurance payout documentation. They found the adjusted records that Gary had described. They found enough. Meanwhile, Imani continued going to work at Harrington PR. She continued meeting with Richard Caldwell. She sat across from him at lunches and listened to him talk and watched him be exactly who he was, comfortable and powerful and utterly unaware that the world he had built was about to come down around him. And she kept her face open and her voice warm, and she did not feel anything she could not control. In March of 2022, the FBI notified Imani that charges were being filed. She asked for one thing. She asked to tell Richard Caldwell herself, first, before the arrest. The agent she had been working with, a patient, thorough woman named Special Agent Diane Morris, thought about it for a long time. Then she said yes. With limitations. Imani would not be alone with him. She would be wired. Imani agreed. She arranged a private dinner with Richard under the pretext of discussing a new campaign for his foundation. They met at a restaurant in Buckhead that Richard liked. Dark wood, leather booths, the kind of place where serious men had serious conversations. Richard was in good spirits. He ordered the same bourbon he always ordered. He asked about her week. He was relaxed and pleasant and completely himself. Imani waited until the main course arrived. Then she reached into her bag and placed a folder on the table between them. "I need to show you something," she said. Richard looked at the folder. "What's this?" "Open it," she said. He opened the folder. The first page was a photograph Imani had obtained from a family album that her Aunt Carol had kept. It showed Marcus Webb at Imani's kindergarten spring recital. He was in the 3rd row, holding a disposable camera, and he was laughing at something Imani had done on stage. He looked completely, unmistakably happy. Richard looked at the photograph for a moment. His expression did not change. "Turn the page," Imani said. He turned the page. Gary Simmons's signed statement. The storage facility rental records. The insurance documents. The adjusted financial records. She watched him go through each page. She watched the color drain slowly from his face, like water leaving a bathtub. She watched his hand, which had been relaxed on the table, tighten almost imperceptibly around his bourbon glass. He got to the last page and stopped. He sat very still for a moment. "Who are you?" he said. His voice was different now, quieter. The performance was gone. "My name is Imani Webb," she said. "Marcus Webb is my father. You took 26 years of his life. You took my mother. You took my childhood. And I have spent the last 2 years sitting across from you and listening to you and collecting every piece of evidence needed to make sure you are held accountable for what you did." Richard stared at her. The silence between them stretched out for a very long moment. "The FBI already has a copy of everything in that folder," she continued. "Gary Simmons has been cooperating for 8 months. Your own financial records are in federal hands. And your attorney," she paused, "is currently in discussions with prosecutors about his own exposure." Something moved across Richard Caldwell's face. It might have been the closest thing to genuine feeling she had ever seen from him. It was not quite guilt. It was something older and colder, the recognition of a man who has finally run out of room. "He was a good man," Richard said. The words came out flat, almost involuntary, like something being expelled. "He is a good man," Imani said. "He has been a good man every day of his life, including the 26 years you took from him." Richard looked down at the table. He did not speak again. Imani folded her hands in front of her and waited. The next morning, at 6:45, FBI agents arrived at the Caldwell estate on Tuxedo Road. Margaret Caldwell was in her garden with her morning coffee when the cars pulled up the long driveway. She stood and watched as the agents walked past her, through the front door of the house she had lived in for 30 years, and emerged 4 minutes later with her husband in handcuffs. Richard Caldwell walked down his own front steps in his bathrobe. His silver hair was uncombed for the first time in perhaps 30 years. He looked, without his suit and his bourbon and his performance, like exactly what he was, a frightened old man being held accountable for the first time in his life. The neighbors who had shaken his hand at galas watched from their driveways. The staff who had served his meals watched from the windows. Margaret Caldwell stood in her garden with her coffee cup and did not move. And somewhere across Atlanta, Imani Webb sat in her midtown apartment and watched the sun come up and felt something unclench inside her chest that had been clenched for 26 years. The legal proceedings moved faster than Imani had dared to hope. With Gary Simmons's cooperation agreement, the federal financial records, and Imani's meticulously documented evidence, the case against Richard Caldwell was overwhelmingly strong. His defense team, a new one, his original attorney having made his own arrangements with prosecutors, spent 4 months exploring every available avenue and ultimately concluded that there were no viable ones. Richard Caldwell pled guilty to insurance fraud, evidence tampering, and the malicious prosecution of Marcus Webb. He was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison and ordered to pay a civil settlement to Marcus Webb that the court deemed appropriate to the scope and duration of the harm caused. 11 years. More than Marcus had served. Marcus Webb's conviction was formally vacated by a Georgia court on a Tuesday morning in September 2022. Imani stood outside the courthouse and listened as the judge read the order into the record, and she held Raymond Cole's arm because her legs were not entirely steady. Raymond, who was 73 years old and had driven himself to the courthouse in a 10-year-old Buick and worn his best cardigan, squeezed her arm back and said nothing. He did not need to. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in October 2022, Marcus Webb walked out of Fulton County Correctional Facility for the last time. He was 58 years old. He had gone in at 32. 26 years. More than half his adult life. Imani was standing at the gate. She had thought about this moment so many times, for so many years, that she had stopped trying to imagine exactly what it would feel like. She had learned that some things cannot be imagined in advance. They can only be lived. Marcus came through the gate in a pair of jeans and a gray shirt that his sister had sent for him to wear home. He was older. Of course he was older, broader across the shoulders than Imani remembered, with gray at his temples and lines around his eyes that had not been there in the photographs. But his walk was the same, unhurried, steady, and his eyes, when he found Imani standing there, were the same eyes from every photograph, every memory, every dream she had carried through 26 years of letters and longing. He stopped walking. He looked at her, really looked at her, the way you look at something you were afraid you might never see again, and he brought both hands up and covered his face. Imani crossed the distance between them and put her arms around her father, and Marcus Webb, who had survived 26 years of injustice with quiet discipline and spiritual stubbornness and the weekly ritual of writing letters to a little girl he could not hold, held his daughter and wept. They stood like that for a long time. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing yet to say that would have been adequate. Eventually, Marcus lifted his head and looked at Imani's face, her mother's cheekbones, his own eyes, something entirely her own in the set of her jaw, and he said, "I never stopped believing someone would come." Imani looked at him. "I was always coming, Daddy," she said. "I was always coming." Raymond Cole was parked 20 feet away in his 10-year-old Buick, pretending to look at his phone, very clearly crying. He drove them to breakfast. Over eggs and coffee at a diner in East Atlanta, not far from the house Marcus had bought for Diana, the house with the garden he had planted without telling her. Marcus and Imani talked for 4 hours. She told him everything. The criminology degree, the name change, Harrington PR, Richard Caldwell's face when she opened the folder, Gary Simmons at his kitchen table in Tennessee, Raymond Cole in the prison library saying the car was never stolen. Marcus listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He looked at his coffee cup. He looked at his daughter. "Your mother," he said. "She would be," he stopped. His jaw worked for a moment. "She would be so proud of you. She already was. She always was. But this," he shook his head. Imani reached across the table and took his hand. After breakfast, Imani drove her father to see Atlanta. They drove slowly, with no particular destination, through neighborhoods Marcus remembered and streets that had changed and skyline additions that had not existed when he went in. He sat in the passenger seat with the window down, watching the city move past him, and Imani drove and did not rush him and let him look at everything he wanted to look at for as long as he wanted to look. At one point, passing a stretch of highway that looked over the downtown skyline, all glass and height and morning light, Marcus said, "It's still a beautiful city." "It's still yours," Imani said. He turned and looked at her. "No," he said. "It's ours." Richard Caldwell began serving his 11-year sentence at a federal correctional institution in late 2022. He was 76 years old. His wife Margaret filed for divorce 3 months after his conviction. Caldwell Enterprises, without its founder and facing the public fallout of the case, was restructured and sold. The name ceased to exist. Gary Simmons, under the terms of his cooperation agreement, served a reduced sentence of 18 months and was released on probation. He wrote a letter to Marcus Webb that Imani read aloud to her father at their kitchen table. Marcus listened to the whole thing. Then he said, "Tell him I forgive him. Not because what he did was okay. Because I don't want to carry it anymore." Raymond Cole was publicly recognized by the Georgia Innocence Project for his role in the case. At 73, he began volunteering as a legal consultant for the organization, reviewing cases from his kitchen table in Decatur with his reading glasses on the end of his nose. Marcus Webb used a portion of his civil settlement to buy a small house in East Atlanta. Different house, same neighborhood. He planted a garden on the left side of the yard. He did not tell anyone. He just let it grow. Imani Webb. She restored her name, formally and publicly, upon her father's release, left Harrington, PR, and enrolled in law school. She intends to specialize in wrongful conviction cases. She keeps the shoebox of letters under her bed. She still checks it every morning. And that is where I leave you, with a father and daughter at a kitchen table in East Atlanta, with a garden growing on the left side of the yard, with 26 years of letters in a shoebox under a bed, with the understanding that justice, real justice, is not always fast, and it is not always easy, and it will sometimes cost you more than you thought you had to give. But it is never, ever beyond reach. Not as long as there is someone who loves you enough to go looking. They tried to silence one man. Instead, they created a daughter who would shake the very foundation of their world. Marcus Webb spent 26 years waiting for someone to come. She was always coming. She was always, always coming. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something, please give it a like. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you are not already part of this community, subscribe right now, because this is what we do here. We tell the stories that matter. We tell them in full. And we never, ever stop before justice finds its way home. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next one.